It's oversteering.
It's understeering.
It's doing both.
What do I do?
I'm gonna show you how to drive every single car right.
And we are gonna show you how a sport car beat an F1.
As usual, before I get into something, I give background and science to bring understanding and backup for every single point I make. The truth is, God made something amazing called a revolution. And you see, a revolution is not just turning around. It has to be revolving around something, ruling over it and controlling whether it even turns or not. The planets revolve around the sun, and all creation revolves around God, as everything was made by him, and without him nothing that is here would be here right now, including you. And as we learned in the study of the mystery of objective beauty, that whatever is made to be beautiful has to follow God's law of beauty. Line harmony that makes proportions that are in harmony. Every part connected to another part along the same trajectory with the same rhythm, but fulfilling different purposes. There's also revolution. It's all revolving around one theme. The fact is, for something to work best and most efficiently, it also has to follow God's law. God also designed air, which means cars need to also follow the laws of aerodynamics. They also need to follow God's law of mass over revolutions. I'm going to use that to explain how to drive a car to perfection in today's video. Just like there's a hierarchy among planets and stars, with everything revolving around the sun, which takes the most energy to run and which is the biggest and heaviest. The biggest, heaviest thing in your car is what everything must revolve around. You get it? So all four wheels must revolve around your engine. Every single thing must revolve around your engine. The proof is in the tires. Let me prove it to you. First, let's just go over a few things. Grip. Grip is sliding friction. Your tire has a contact patch. Now, many cars and tires are different in the way they respond to steering input. Torque. Torque is force at a distance. So in an engine, torque is how big the diameter of your crank pin line is on your crankshaft. You know that too. Revolution, pivot, axis, and lines. Something revolving has what we call revolutions. That's how we count how many times it revolves. For there to be revolutions, there has to be a pivot to revolve around. And all of the time is mass revolving around that pivot. Mass from the thing revolving or connected to the thing revolving. The further away it is from the pivot, the more mass is magnified, because mass at a distance is weight torque. You know that too. Now in a car there are four tires and many things that revolve, but when something is revolving and moving towards a trajectory at the same time, there are access lines. Access lines that are lines the masses have. You know that too. If you don't, now you know. Now my theory, all four wheels must rotate around the engine, since the engine is the biggest, heaviest thing in your car. Well, unless you're this guy, then you're the thing that the car must revolve around. A front to rear wheel speed ratio that is variable according to the rotation pivot location.
The only reason wheel speed ratio matters is because if the engine is not dead center in the car, the wheels farthest from the engine have a distance to travel rotating on their axis.
During cornering, the inside wheel and outside wheel has variable speed ratios. It gets more aggressive, favoring outside wheels going faster by closeness to the pivot of rotation, which is the engine, if it's not you. So our first car that we're going to test to see how to drive it at full potential, not wasting one bit of the car, driving it perfectly balanced. The car is a Toyota 86. The A86 has a 1.6 liter naturally aspirated inline-4 engine mounted in the front position, 50% in front of the front axle, leaning slightly offset backwards. For all four wheels to rotate around the engine, the rear wheels must have a rather aggressive offset angle. They have to travel around the pivot, the engine. There should be an aggressive high wheel speed ratio, favoring rear wheels going faster, balanced along the axis of the rotation. While the front wheels are perfectly on either side of the engine, they should be rotating around the engine by a perfect inside to outside wheel speed ratio around the super short rotational axis they have around the engine. The aggression level that the position requires is almost like the inside wheel should be moving in reverse and the outside wheel should be accelerating forward fast. Okay, obviously not literally reverse, but you get my point. And there is zero steering needed. Not just needed, wanted. Only turn in initiation. Rather, the car is facing the steering input the car would need without this perfect rotation. Once the front to rear wheel speed ratio and the front to rear offset angle is perfectly synced in axis of rotation, the front wheel's open diff will allow the front wheels inside and outside wheel speed ratio to auto sync in perfect rotation due to the road forcing each wheel to the correct speeds to sync perfectly in the rotation axis. But the rear inside and outside wheel speed ratio can only be tuned by driver skill and differential tuning. And by the speed the car is moving forward, in the direction the car is facing, the rear wheels are pushing the engine forward hard in the direction it's rotating around the engine. Any more rotation than this caused by too much throttle causing a drift or something, and you no more pushing your engine but rather pushing the space before your engine and wasting all the energy. You are driving more unbalanced than your mother.
What?
The S2000 is a little pocket rocket with a 2-liter naturally aspirated inline-4 engine with VTEC that sits behind your front axle. That's what makes it front mid-engine. But due to the engine being inside the wheelbase, now the front wheels also rotate around the engine by micro steering inputs. The wheel speed ratios are slightly lower and the offset angle is also lower. This means you can be more aggressive with the throttle, opening it wider because you have more leverage to push your engine with the rear wheels while they are also rotating around the engine. Yes, I know this can get very confusing. Just pause the video if your brain is hurting. By the distance the rear wheels travel in an FR to perfectly rotate around the engine and move towards the trajectory, they are also pushing the engine in the direction the car is rotating. So there's more room to push the engine for wider throttle opening, faster entry, mid-corner and exit. Everything is faster. A Shelby Daytona is the king of the front mid-engine layout. The engine sits not just behind the front axle but behind the front wheels, so you can open the throttle wider, put more power down, turn harder, just drive faster. And just like the S2000, no fancy electric systems to compensate for an imbalance, just good old-fashioned balance. Your inside to outside wheel speed ratio will be much less aggressive since now the front wheels can actually rotate around the engine, with the engine being a distance from the wheels and not the wheels being on either side of the engine. But there is a car hidden under the blankets. And this ain't an elephant in the room because it is one of the furthest things from an elephant. It has a 4.8 liter naturally aspirated V10 mounted behind the front axle. Then there's a drive shaft going towards the rear of the car. And in the mid-rear position is a trans-axle 6-speed automated single-clutch manual gearbox. The gearbox gives rear weight, increasing the rear grip, but it also has inertia. Does this look like an imbalance to you? You wouldn't be wrong, but at the same time you are wrong. Let me explain why. You would think that in cornering there are two things wanting to be pivot of rotation, like in a 488 that also has a transaxle, but that sticks out of the rear boots instead. The engine and the gearbox. So four-wheel gripping using the gearbox as a pivot of rotation during the turn, you are pulling your engine. No good. And using the engine as a pivot of rotation, the transaxle gives you more grip, but also inertia that makes the rear want to slide excessively further. Well, that's where you're wrong. That is not proper rotation if that's the result. You're missing your engine if that's the result. Because the placement of the gearbox is still within the wheelbase of the car. It is in line with the rear wheel's axis line created by the rotation around the engine and the trajectory of where the car is going. It's synced in harmony with that line. It's like a third wheel, so it shouldn't act as an inertial liability. The LFA's gearbox does have inertia, totally 100%, you can't have weight without inertia, but it can be used for the advantage, putting more grip on the rear tires, being the extra power the rear wheels have to rotate around the engine even harder, so you can corner even faster. This all just needs laser sharp control, honed by a true ninja. That's the only way you can drive an LFA properly. An AMG GTR makes it so much easier to drive the same layout of an LFA. It has opposing rear wheel steering. The rear wheel steering doesn't only help to rotate the rear wheels around the engine, but it also keeps traction. As the inertia of the transaxle pulls the rear out, the rear wheel steering catches the rear tires, releasing some inertial pressure off the rear tires, preventing traction loss. It's a true marvel to drive. But there is something that at first glance will be a total contradiction, but is my favorite platform out of the front mid-engine cars. The Mazda RX7, FC and FD, and the Ferrari F12 TDF. The RX7 from the FC gen to the FD gen has a 1.3 liter, or counting every single cylinder for intake, exhaust and combustion, it's a 2.6 liter twin turbo, twin rotor engine mounted behind the front axle. It's super short and very small. The gearbox is right behind it, and the front is so fast that they had to put same way rear wheel steering on it to keep the rear gripping and slow down the front end. It was just too fast. Driven wrong, not rotating the wheels around the engine, the rear wheel steering is able to make the engine overhaul the front end with weight torque. It makes it feel like the engine is mounted a meter in front of the front axle. But this rear wheel steering system creates a hidden feature of high-speed cornering. It demands more aggression in throttle input to rotate the four wheels around the engine. It's very much like the LFA, taking the demand for a ninja's precision to drive it. They are in the same league. Whereas on the other hand, an AMG GTR is helping you rotate the four wheels around the engine. So in the RX7, opening the throttle to make the rear wheels rotate around the engine, the margin is very small and tricky like an LFA, but this time it's due to the rear wheel steering. And there is a super narrow margin for error. This means it's easy to just drift too much, miss your engine, put pressure on your rear tires, mess it all up. When every single input is perfect to make the rear wheels rotate around the engine, they'll be rotating around the engine but also pushing the engine at a slightly different direction to the S2000. As the rear wheels would be pointing more inside, they will try to flip the car the other way. That's how powerful these rear wheels are. That's why rear wheel steering is no joke. So there needs to be some more steering input or just more rotation. And that makes you go even faster around the turn. These are all cars that beg you to turn faster. The Mitsubishi Lan Evo has an engine 100% in front of the axle. It's sideways mounted with the gearbox right beside it on the left. The rotation of all four wheels around the engine is kind of not like an 8.6. The rear wheels have the same principles, has a very similar axis, but the front wheels are rotating around the engine that is in front of it, just like the rear wheels. In this case, yes, just like the A86 and the other cars, where the car is facing is the steering angle input it would have without rotation. So again, not much need to steer at all. Now we come to one of the greatest icons the Nissan GTR. What an icon it was and still is. Its legacy will live on forever. It is a four-wheel drive monster with a perfectly balanced engine. If you don't know what a perfectly balanced engine is, then go check out my last video on the 2JZ. I uncover it there. The front wheel speed ratio can be less aggressive than an AE86 because the wheels are further from the dead center pivot point of the engine. Although like the AE86, it's still aggressive. Like the Evo, it's the other way around. It's not further back like an S2000, it's further forward. The RB26 DETT engine is 80% in front of the front axle. There's opposing rear wheel steering for normal cornering, sharp corners, hairpins and all. And then when you get really high speed, taking bends, there's same way rear wheel steering to keep the car stable. This opposing rear wheel steering also helps with offset angle along the rotation axis, not needing too much drifting skill to get that perfectly balanced rotation on the axis. And with the subject of wheel speed ratio, well, the GTR does things a little different. Just like the Evo, yes, there's four-wheel drive, but the whole system of rear wheel steering and four-wheel drive at Tesla ETS, this can be driven in two ways. It's easy for the car to make the driver feel like he's perfectly rotating it and driving fast at the limit. When you do it right, it can be extremely fast. It can be deadly quick. But I mean, even when Keiichi Tsuchiya drives in this way of more grip, front end pull, along with the extra 75% of torque on the rear pushing it, he still rotates the car, making those short bursts he does it with his A86. He knows what pulling the engine is. The thing is, the car sorts out nearly 50% of driving for you. The GTR is also supposed to perfectly rotate around the engine. Yes, the rear wheel steering must help to offset the car, putting it near the perfect rotation axis. And on throttle, it helps push the engine. But it can't do it all. It doesn't do it all. You gotta also rotate it till the point of being at the perfect rotation axis. Just like the AMG GTR, the Tesla ETS Pro that is in the GTR from the R33 till now makes the rear diff lock under gas. Now we come to mid-engine, where we can finally turn the steering wheel. Wow, it's been a long time since I've done that. It's as mid as it can be without being on your lap. Because I mean, you still need to sit in the car and you can't sit on the front wheels, okay? A mid-engine car also has the engine as the pivot of rotation, or should. Driving an MR, mid-engine rear-wheel drive, that's what it means. You're rotating the front wheels around the engine by steering input, and the rear wheels have a much fainter rotation offset angle since the pivot is shifted much further back. Although exiting a corner in a mid-engine car, you still gotta rotate the rear wheels around the engine to push the engine during acceleration, getting all the grip of the weight transferred to the rear. Yeah, you still can't just floor it out of a hairpin while you're at that sideways angle. This is also the way Formula 1 cars are built. Although the F1 car is just much longer, like 5 miles longer, so it makes the engine feel more mid-rear engine. But technically it is mid-engine because the gearbox is in between the engine and the differential. For it to be pure mid-rear engine, the engine has to be almost touching the differential. But what if I told you there's something better than a Formula 1 car? What? No, that's impossible. Because a Formula 1 car by principle just should be the best of all time. It's the greatest. There's hardly any regulations. It's an open wheel race car that doesn't even have to be road legal. I know all of this. I even said it in the last video. Come on. You don't know just how powerful, to what extent, how great the Honda NSX is.
Another legend that deserves an equal shout-out is the Porsche Carrera GT, which we will talk about in another video.
An NSX's engine, staying within the wheelbase of the car, it's just in front of the rear wheels, with no mass beyond the rear axle. Rather, the gearbox is right beside the engine, which is actually sideways mounted. The advantage the NSX has over the Formula 1.
We're gonna compare them in a situation of a too much throttle oversteer.
When exiting a super slow tight hairpin corner, as we know, it's not all about weight on the rear end, but also placement and everything else. So exiting a very slow corner at that angle, still exiting but you want to put the power down, with an F1's engine rather a little further front than the NSX's, going full throttle, you're not going to be pushing your engine. You're not going to be rotating your rear wheels around the engine. But you're missing the engine, pushing the space of nothingness and a little bit of your gearbox, spinning out. Why? Not because of lack of rear weight, but because of missing the engine.
But this doesn't mean you can't exit as fast. It's just different geometries that demand slightly different driving styles.
In an F1 car, you still need to rotate the wheels around the engine the way a mid-engine car does it. Whereas a full throttle dash in a super slow tight corner in an NSX, you're almost not able to miss your engine. And it's easy to brutally rotate the rear wheels around the engine with a wide open throttle. So why aren't F1s using the NSX's layout? Well, they're not going back to transaxles, and that's the only way to have a gearbox in a car with an engine that far back. But they can use the NSX's layout. That's what we've been talking about. But you see, the NSX also has a disadvantage that I haven't told you about. The NSX has a weakness. Nope, I'm not talking about its age. I'm not talking about the fact that it doesn't have a carbon fiber monocoque. I'm talking about the wide engine and gearbox right next to each other. Their edges have weight torque. It's more mass to rotate, whereas an F1 car has the gearbox behind the engine. This whole setup makes it much more easy to just turn in and change direction, and it's also more twitchy, as F1 is also technically mid-engine, but far enough to be called mid-rear engine.
What nonsense! The NSX is not a disadvantage.
It all comes down to preference. Whatever floats your boat, whatever goes along with your style of driving, you pick that car. I think Fernando Alonso would like an NSX. Senna likes it. The rear wheels are easily within range to rotate around the engine. Then why? Well, the only other reason I can think of is the NSX's engine layout would be a disadvantage on an F1 car because they would need to put ballast on the side of the gearbox because the gearbox is lighter than the engine. In every car that's the case, the gearbox is always lighter than the engine. And putting ballast, you're adding weight. And that is out of line. Weight means time loss. Can't have that. Tell me in the comments if there's any better reason. The engine layout of this car just encourages you to turn harder with higher entry speed, fast cornering. And remember when I said the balance of your car controls your racing line, and that there is no such thing as a sure thing for all cars. There's a platform. The more forward the engine gets, the more acceleration at entry is liked. And the FR is liking the wide line with the late apex for exit speed. Yet the further rear the engine goes, the more liked is a deceleration entry. Although the NSX and F1 car, they still like super fast entry speed. The turn entry inputs are flipping with this next one. The Ferrari!
A Ferrari's advantage is in its liability, the transaxle, and it is braking. The Ferrari is a master of it. Hahaha lol, this deserves its own video, so we are gonna skip it for now. Sub and bell to stay tuned for the coming video.
McLaren fixed the problem of a transaxle to a point. They seem to like mid-turn speed. They adopted an open differential, and they have an electrically controlled hydraulic suspension system that does the job of an anti-roll bar but absorbs shock when it goes over bumps to make the tires always grip the road. The open differential works good because the engine is so close to the rear wheels. So exiting with power, there's slightly less understeer than a Ferrari. But still, an NSX's foundation setup trumps these, with no clever systems, but only good old-fashioned balance. Finally, the Beetle, the Porsche, the 911. The Beetle has evolved over the years from a rear engine car to a rear mid-engine car. The engine was moved from 100% behind the rear axle to now slightly on the rear axle. It's basically over the rear axle. It's a rear mid-engine car. I'm going to explain why this is so and why I prefer the old layout. Sounds like a contradiction, I know, lol. I've been saying the mesh should be within the wheelbase, but just let me cook. I'm going to explain it with my dream Beetle that hasn't been made, and I'm calling it the 911 GT8R. I want a flat plane crankshaft V8, but this one I want to rev 10,000 RPM, making 550 horsepower maybe. But besides all that, let's get to the point. Balance. The engine position, same in the 911 997 gen, behind the rear axle completely, 1000% rear engine. So yes, my front wheels have a super long axis of rotation to rotate around, and they are rotating simply by steering input. But because the rear wheels are also in front of the rear engine, for them to rotate perfectly around the engine, I want same way directed rear wheel steering. Rear wheel steering that goes the same direction of the front wheels, synced in perfectly at the perfect rotational axis to the engine, which is the pivot of rotation, working in harmony with the front wheels. And that is perfect rotation for my Beetle. Porsche, please make this car for me, please. I think the reason this hasn't been done is because it's quite difficult to drive, snappy. But also the reason this hasn't been done is because they say they got something even better. The 991 layout. The engine is moved forward to the rear mid position, sitting behind the rear axle and on the rear axle. Due to the engine being further forward, the rear wheels should move differently. Very much like the A86's front wheels, almost moving opposing each other's speeds. And there is opposed rear wheel steering. The opposed rear wheel steering acts on the geometry of the car, giving the feel, almost making the engine more forward, more mid-engine. It makes turning faster, it eases the inertial load of the engine, you know, AMG GTR stuff. But it stops as soon as the rear wheels lose traction. The main thing in a Porsche is rotating the front wheels around the engine. Now observing the build of the Beetle, it becomes clear that a Porsche is probably the easiest car to take to the limit, to drive to full potential. No fancy drift techniques are needed to balance the whole car, rotating the rear wheels around an engine that's front mid mounted. You just turn the steering wheel. This has been my theory on how to drive every car to full potential. At the end of the day, in perfect driving, every single thing revolves around the engine. In what I explained, I used the simple examples, fundamental layouts with a few different tweaks and stuff. But the truth is there are three factors. Foundation, that's the layout and whether you have a transaxle or not. Then there's tuning, to make the car the best for the next thing, which is the driver. Driving style and technique, which is made to get the car closer and closer to the limit, to full potential. Which brings me to the title of our next video, which will be another one of how a driver took his car to full potential. But tuning, most of all, is about getting the full potential out of the car to increase the limit, lift the limit. So tuning should listen to the foundation. The driver should listen to the tuning, while the foundation should listen to God's law.